Alright guys, so today's video is inspired by a question from one of my Patreon supporters. This is from Bill. Bill, thank you very much for the question, and Bill's question is, it's an interesting one because he includes with his question a video clip, and this is a video clip from the TV show Vikings. I'm just going to admit, full disclosure, I have never watched the TV show Vikings. I've never been interested in watching it. You know, you've got these guys who look like a cross between like heavy metal guitarists and bikers, and these are supposed to be, you know, the Danes of the 9th century. I mean, it's just absurd. You know, like with their leather pants and their spiked wristbands or whatever. I mean, it really is ridiculous looking. But in Bill's message, he includes this clip from Vikings, which shows an actress who is supposed to be the wife of Alfred the Great having an affair with a Viking. So this is in this show, you know, Alfred the Great's wife is having an affair with a Viking. And Bill asks me, is there any historical basis for this? Is there anything at all in history to indicate that such a thing could have happened? And just to cut to the chase, the answer is no. There's absolutely nothing in history that would lead us to believe that Alfred the Great's wife would have had an affair or did have an affair with a Viking. Now, first of all, just in regards to Alfred the Great's wife specifically, we know very little about her. We don't have much information about her. So I think we have to ask ourselves, is any of this plausible? The way that, adultery is often portrayed in these movies set in the Middle Ages, is it plausible? Like, just in the circumstance of Alfred the Great's wife here, I mean, there's all sorts of stuff that we can break down in this clip that shows us how ridiculous it is and how unlikely such a scenario would be. First of all, the clip shows Alfred the Great's wife, Ellsworth was her name, walking around in what looks to be a marketplace. So she's totally by herself. So it's like, okay, so the highest ranking noblewoman in the Kingdom of Wessex is just out for a stroll, unprotected, unaccompanied, and she runs into this Viking guy and they kind of have a little back and forth, and then they go off to some house somewhere. Here's the thing we have to look at. First of all, what life would have actually been like for Alfred the Great's wife. High-ranking noblewomen in the Middle Ages, they didn't just say, you know, I think I'm going to go for a little walk out in the public square. If a medieval noblewoman was going to go to a marketplace, and they did at times, they would go with a very large entourage. They would have many of their own ladies with them, because a woman of Alfred the Great's wife's rank would have had many female attendants. These would have been noblewomen, servant women, who would have been her companions, women who would have taken care of her every need. Also, she would have had male troops with her. She would have had armed male accompaniment. So there would have been men with weapons. These would have been her husband's men assigned to that particular duty. They would have been out with her if she was doing something like this. It's just ridiculous to have a scene in this TV show where Alfred the Great's wife is just off walking around by herself and she can run into one of her husband's enemies just out for a stroll. This is absurd. And this brings me to the title of the video. And the question I wanted to ask was, how common was it in the Middle Ages for noblewomen to engage in these extramarital affairs? I mean, you watch movies and TV shows, you'd think that every single queen, had a lover on the side. But the truth is that given the daily realities of life for the medieval aristocracy, I think this was unlikely. I think it was rare for medieval noblewomen to engage in illicit relationships. Now, I'm not saying it did not happen. Most certainly it did happen. We have examples, like for example, the wife of Edward II. She was unfaithful to him, but he was kind of notoriously a weakling. And he apparently even had predilections that maybe didn't include her. First of all, just the way that people lived in the Middle Ages, like medieval aristocrats were very rarely alone. And for a medieval noblewoman, again, she would have constantly been surrounded by her ladies in waiting. These would have been high-ranking women who, were her attendants. She also would have had military escorts around her. There would have been guards looking out for her. The idea that a queen or a high-ranking noblewoman would have much opportunity to engage in an affair without anybody knowing about it, this seems pretty unlikely. I mean, if you're the Queen of France and you're having an affair, some of your ladies-in-waiting are probably going to have quite a bit of motivation to tell the king about that or tell somebody else about this. Just like in terms of the medieval environment, there wasn't a lot of opportunity. We think about the way buildings are laid out today with like lots and lots of rooms. Medieval fortresses and houses had fewer rooms than buildings do today. There was less opportunity to kind of get to a place where you were totally secluded. Medieval literature talks about a place where lovers often meet is in an orchard. An orchard in the medieval environment may have been a place that was more private because it's kind of just out there. It's a bunch of trees. Maybe it provides some cover. But again, the idea that like the Queen of France can just go steal away to some orchard somewhere and meet her boyfriend. I mean, this is pretty unlikely because the people around her would know what she was doing. I think we should also consider the fact that for medieval aristocratic women, adultery was such a hugely socially unacceptable thing. I mean, this is something that could absolutely blacken your reputation in your society. A medieval noblewoman who did this, I mean, she could even be risking her life. I mean, her husband could take some serious reprisals against her. And then also, I think we need to take into account the reality of medieval religiosity. The truth is that this was the age of piety, and lots of medieval aristocratic women were quite pious. They were very serious about their faith. As I said earlier, we don't know much about Alfred the Great's wife, but one tradition is that she was a very holy and pious woman. I think this is far more likely than this sort of totally baseless concept that she would be having an affair with a Viking. In fact, Elswith is celebrated as a saint in the Eastern Church. Although we don't have a lot of material about Elswith, we don't know much about her. If you were making a TV show about her, or making a TV show where she was going to appear, it would make much more sense to show her as kind of a pious, dutiful wife who was devoted to her husband. This is far more likely in terms of what we do know about her than the idea that she was engaged in illicit affairs with Vikings, which would be virtually impossible. So again, I'm not saying here that this never happened. I don't want to give the impression that never at any time were medieval aristocratic women unfaithful. I think, there were plenty of examples of it, but I do think we have to keep in mind that this was probably a rare thing. This was an unusual thing for a woman in this station to do. Now, for men, it was quite a bit more socially acceptable. The church did put quite a bit of pressure on medieval aristocratic men to stay faithful to their marriage vows, and as the Middle Ages wore on and Christianity became more and more deeply interwoven into the society, it became more and more difficult for medieval men to get away with this. But, there was more of a tolerance for this idea of kind of, men sowing their wild oats and that kind of thing. Certainly it was more socially acceptable for like a knight to have a mistress before he was married. Richard the Lionheart, for example, he had an illegitimate son. But, for women, of course, there was a very strong social pressure for them to remain virgins until they were married. And then once they were married, it was absolutely a unthinkable type of sin if a medieval noblewoman was to violate her marital vows. But we do have plenty of examples of medieval noblemen who were very much faithful to their wives. Of course, Louis IX of France was famously like this. William the Conqueror, interestingly enough, he, for all his brutality as a ruler, he was very much faithful to his wife. Just to kind of give an example of what I'm talking about here, if we look at one of the most famous, so-called femme fatales from the Middle Ages, Eleanor of Aquitaine, I think she's kind of considered to be a bit of a femme fatale. Her enemies widely accused her of being an adulteress. This was, supposedly she was a woman who took many lovers, this kind of thing. And even today, many of her admirers will say this about her. They will say, well, she wasn't held back by those old, stuffy, medieval moral maxims. She had all kinds of guys that she, got with. The truth is, historians have long pointed out that there's a good chance Eleanor of Aquitaine never had any illicit relationships. She was at one point imprisoned in a tower by her husband, the King of England, Henry II, but not because she was unfaithful, but because she fomented rebellion against him. Yeah, the truth is we don't know. We have no way of knowing for sure, but in terms of what evidence we have, there's really not much convincing evidence at all that she engaged in an affair. What we have are rumors and allegations thrown at her by people who had a problem with her, by her enemies. This is basically what we have in terms of the idea that she was having affairs, but there's really not much good evidence at all that she did engage in affairs. So she may very well have never had an affair throughout her life. She may have always been faithful to her husband. And she had two husbands. First, she was married to the King of France, then the King of England. And again, I do think we have to look at this issue of opportunity. Did Eleanor of Aquitaine ever even have the opportunity to engage in an affair? She may very well have never had that opportunity at all. And finally, just to bring this video back to the initial inspiration for the video, I want to question the very logic of portraying Alfred the Great's wife as being unfaithful to him. This is an historical figure who, everything we know about him kind of leads us to have a very positive perception of him. This was a great king, a man who defended his kingdom in the face of very difficult odds. This was also a king who was very concerned with the welfare of his subjects, looked at education, provided education, did all sorts of things to improve the lives of his people. And so I think there is a certain obligation, in my opinion, to be faithful to the history and do an historical narrative as faithfully to the true history as possible. Obviously, there is some leeway for artistic license, but even if somebody were to say, well, we just think this would make this a really good story, at the same time, I think it's really unfair to the history of Alfred the Great to portray him this way. We can certainly say that there are historical figures that they would absolutely never portray in this way. Like, they would never stray from the history and show something horribly negative about them because of their respect for those historical figures. But why doesn't that extend to Alfred the Great? Well, I think that it should, and I think that it shows some bad faith on the part of the makers of Vikings. So I think you can argue that it is very much unfair to portray Alfred the Great's wife as being unfaithful to him. I think it was definitely the wrong choice. Highly questionable. But anyway, thanks for the question, Bill. I think this brings up some important issues with the medieval world that we should be looking at. I want to just end this video with a quick announcement. I have been asked by thechristianchannel.com to write the script for their new TV series about the Crusades. The title of the show is Knights of the Cross. This is going to be an historical drama set during the Crusades. Think of a Game of Thrones type series, except this is going to be an historically accurate vision of the Crusades. I'm really excited about this. This is exactly the type of project I've always wanted to work on. This is it. This is a live action TV show of the Crusades. I'm writing it, and I'm thrilled. You guys can support the project. Click on the link down below. Sign up at christianchannel.com. Use the promo code KNIGHTS to support the project for Knights of the Cross, the TV series, and get 10% off. There you go. I can't wait for you guys to see this show.